So we're moving more thickly into the Gospel of Matthew now. And you'll recall that we're still really at the beginning of what Jesus has to say to his disciples about what this whole endeavor is that he's about. He's come into the Galilee, proclaimed that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, called some disciples, traveled around Galilee a little bit, and then he went up this hill and sat down and began what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And remember that he begins the Sermon on the Mount. Even that name is a little deceptive. It's not really a sermon. It's more like a teaching. He's laying the groundwork for what the task of being a disciple is all about. And he begins that with the Beatitudes, which are not prescriptions for how we are to live. They are declarations about where God is present in the world. And so he begins, "Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness and try to make peace in a world where there is no peace." That's where God is. In the most hopeless of cases, in terms of people's lives, that's where God is. That's not a prescription for how we're supposed to live and seek it out. It's a declaration that God's grace is everywhere, undergirding up the very most broken lives in the world. That's where God's presence begins, perhaps. And then he says last week to these same disciples, "Well, you are the salt of the earth, and you're the light of the world." That is, you have this particular calling to ferment the world with your presence. And that's what your task is. Today we get to this section of the sermon where he's saying, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit murder,' for instance. But I say to you, you shouldn't be angry." So there are 6 of these things. We'll hear some again next week as well. You've heard this, but here's the expanded understanding of how it is you are to be. It's important to understand and to remember that this sermon that Matthew records is written on a mountain, and it's intended to recall for all of us another mountain, that is Mount Sinai, and the handing down of the commandments to the people of Israel and to Moses on a mountain. And this is, in that sense, the new Sinai, where Jesus is preaching. And what were those laws all about on Sinai? Well, they were about trying to order a person's life so that they could live in the presence of God. There is in the Bible, at the beginning and at the end, a vision of God's kingdom, a perfect place, a place where God's will is enacted. And of course, at the beginning, we have that in the Garden of Eden, this sort of mythological place where everything is at peace and everything is in accord with God's will. And we have it at the end of the Bible in terms of the heavenly Jerusalem. Same thing. Everything at the end of time will be in this same state of peace and harmony. The intention of the law that's handed down on Mount Sinai is to be able to live in accord with those two places. to restore God's intent in the act of creation. So the intent of the Sermon on the Mount is the same. That is to say, here is a pattern of life that reflects God's intent. For instance, God, when God created the world, did not intend murder, says Jesus. But he goes further and he says he doesn't just not intend murder, he did not intend anger, which is pretty remarkable. He wants this to be a peaceable place. That was God's intent, that it would be a peaceable place. God didn't intend when God created the world that there should be adultery. More than that, Jesus says he didn't even intend that you would lust, that you would objectify another person as a sexual object more than anything else. God didn't intend that we make oaths, he says today, that we put our hand on the Bible and swear we will do something or won't do something. He didn't intend us to do that. He intended us to simply live such authentic lives that our yes would be yes and our no would be no. There is in all of this teaching of the Sermon on the Mount a striving after a kind of righteousness that is of a different measure than the righteousness that has been portrayed in the keeping of the law. That is, just before this, Jesus has told them, your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Exceed, not in terms of the letter of the law, but in terms of the intent of God for God's creation.